Good evening. Smith College acknowledges and appreciates that the space in which we gather today is built within Nonotuck ancestral homelands. We recognize our present-day neighboring indigenous nations, the Nipmuc and the Wampanoag to the east, the Mohegan, Pequot, and Narragansett to the south, the Mohican and Mohawk to the west, and the Abenaki to the north. Finally, we acknowledge and celebrate the presence of indigenous people here among us today. My name is Tim Johnson. I'm the director of the Botanic Garden of Smith College, and welcome to you all. A few logistical notes and thank yous before I welcome Provost and Dean of the Faculty, Michael Thurston, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Tonight's event is being live streamed on Facebook and YouTube. Welcome to those of you joining us virtually. If you would like to be notified when the recording is available, please be sure to sign up for our e-newsletter, digitalis at garden.smith.edu. I do hope you'll join us after the lecture for a preview of the Mum Show and Lyman Conservatory and an after-hours look at our current exhibit, The Bell Jars, Lyman Conservatory and Sylvia Plath's Botanical Imagination. The Bell Jars explores Plath's interactions with Lyman, her time studying botany at Smith, and how those experiences influence the botanical images and symbolism that run throughout her work. The exhibit invites visitors to inhabit Lyman as Plath once did, and to explore Plath's botanical imagination through the arts, humanities, and sciences. We're grateful for the many campus partners who made this exhibit possible through their financial and intellectual contributions. It is also imperative that I thank the people who made tonight's event and the annual Mum Show possible. First, thank you to the Department of Anthropology for co-sponsoring tonight's event. Thank you to our colleagues in ITS, College Relations, and Events Planning for technical assistance, and to Manager of Education Sarah Loomis for programming tonight's event. And a huge thank you to the team that brought this year's Mum Show to life. It takes a year of planning, growing, pinching, and pruning to bring these two magical weeks together. Thank you to the many people who made the show possible, our students Giselle Greenberg, Sophia Holmes, Allie Warnell, Caitlin Robertson, Chloe Gold, and Meredith Jones, and staff Dave Dion, Ben Green, Lily Carone, and show producer Dan Babineau. Let's give them a round of applause, please. I also want to thank our community volunteers for your help welcoming visitors, and our friends at the Botanic Garden of Smith College for your financial support. You are all here tonight because you are already a part of our community, and if you are not yet a friend, it's a great time to join as we are in our fall membership drive. Members receive a number of benefits, including 10% off merchandise, access to members-only hours at our annual Mum Show and Bulb Show, and reciprocal entry to over 345 other gardens around the country. For more details, you can visit our website, garden.smith.edu, or our main desk at Lyman Conservatory. Next, Provost and Dean of the Faculty, Michael Thurston, will introduce tonight's lecturer.
Thanks, Tim, and welcome to you all. It's really nice to see you. I'm going to start with something that kind of reminds me of one of those, a physicist, an economist, and an English professor walk into a bar sort of lines. An anthropologist puts together an exhibit focused on a poet that's hosted in a botanic garden. And I know we chuckle, right, because this sounds like a joke. And in fact, I think that is the paradigmatic liberal arts proposition. And when Tim and Colin came to my office last spring to talk about this kind of wild idea that they had for this exhibit because of some stuff that Colin had found in research, I was thrilled at the prospect. And the exhibit has measured up and more to that promise. So I'm really grateful to the work that you guys have done to bring this thing to life. More than just representing what the liberal arts can do and the real enactment of interdisciplinarity at every level, from the intellectual to the structural and physical and the spatial. The exhibit, I think, importantly, foregrounds plant literacy, something about which we can't say enough at this time when we are thinking a lot about sustainability and threats to sustainability and to biodiversity as a consequence of massive climate change during the Anthropocene. It also, and I think that this dovetails with what I know of Colin's work in his scholarship and in the classroom, is an example of really innovative pedagogy. You think together things that we tend to think separately in our disciplines and divisions, and you put them together in a space that might not be the one that immediately comes to mind. And all kinds of wonderful things happen as a consequence. So it is a great pleasure, after having seen the exhibit and after having come to know something of Colin's work, to be able to introduce him and his lecture this evening to you. I think we're all in for a real treat. Colin is a multi-species ethnographer. He's got enormously wide-ranging interests. They transcend disciplinary boundaries. I should have said, not just any anthropologist, but an anthropologist whose work focuses on water and the politics and the culture around water in Africa. But in that work and in the other connections that Colin has made across the curriculum, he thinks about botany and capitalism and poetry, three things that I didn't think that I would link with commas. But that I am happy to tonight. Plant conservatories as a specific kind of site that have their own particular histories. Landscape, water, ecology, bureaucracy, migration, gender, and colonialism. And out of this, he builds a profoundly interdisciplinary and compelling intellectual project. His book, The Fluvial Imagination on Lesotho's Water Export Economy, which was published by the University of California Press in 2022, is fantastic. It is deeply researched, it is eloquently argued, and it is beautifully written. One of the perks of my job is I serve on the Tenure and Promotion Committee, and that's how I got to read Colin's book. I also think of it as the Making Michael Feel Inadequate Committee, and Colin, your book really was a perfect example of that. We are wonderfully at Smith not only scholars but teachers, teacher scholars, scholar teachers, and this is absolutely true of Colin, who brings the kind of thinking that he does in this magnificent book, which is about a whole complex of water and water policy and cultural aspirations around and imaginations around water, into the classroom. His understanding of the role of the educator is precisely to blur the boundaries between scholarship and teaching, and he does this in the most wonderful and innovative ways. I've mentioned the exhibit, the bell jars, Lyman Conservatory, and Sylvia Plath's Botanical Imagination as one example. I've said something about Colin's book, not nearly enough, but that is another example. But in all of this work, he plays around with these binaries of instruction and discovery, seeking always to go beyond that sense of the sage on the stage and to be a learner along with students who are learners, so that it is in collaboration and in the communal exploration of profound questions and problems that the really important insights and the products can come. Colin developed the idea for this exhibit out of a class. He then worked on it with some students, Stride students, right? So research students who are working along with him. One of them describes the experience in this way. This is a quote: "Professor Hoag's passion and excitement about what he's teaching is so palpable. He encouraged me to go off to explore a somewhat strange little niche about queerness, ferns, and olfaction, despite the threads of connection at first seeming hazy." That, I think, is the beautiful way to put it. These connections that at first seem hazy come into ever clearer sorts of understanding through the collaborative work that we do to explore them. And to continue with the quote, "Colin kept encouraging me, and I was able to delve deeply in a topic that excited me. His classroom is truly interdisciplinary, and the sources he pulls from for content readings and the like are," all caps, "awesome. I discovered some of my favorite academics in that class." So here, in that quotation, as in Colin's work, in the exhibit, in his book, in his teaching, is the power of disrupting culture. Scholarship, research, an exhibit that provides a valuable commodity in a busy world, the spaces where we can imagine together, where we can explore and contemplate and discover, and through these practices, come up with a better future for the interspecies community to which we all belong. I think that this is the thread that I might trace through all of Colin's work. It's a thread that I think we will be able to hear and see in what we're going to witness tonight. And so please join me in welcoming Colin to the stage for his lecture, whose title I forgot to write down and has now disappeared because Tim advanced the slide and I had been counting on being able to read it from the screen. But Colin will repeat it for you. Colin.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. I'm so honored to be here, and I want to thank the Botanic Garden for inviting me to give these remarks tonight. I'm really excited for you all to visit the conservatory to see the Plath exhibit, and I want to start by thanking my collaborators on that project, including especially the core team that's been a part of it, notably Sarah Loomis and Lily Carone, who are really the main drivers behind this whole thing, but also importantly, critically, two Stride students that I've been working with, Amelia Nair and Gabi Dondes. As well as all the students in my spring 2023 colloquium who produced these fabulous essays for an associated website. At the Botanic Garden, Tim Johnson and Jimmy Grogan and others. Special thanks to the expert guidance of Karen Kukil and Amanda Golden. Many other units and people at Smith deserve thanks, if only I had the time. I also note, just as a warning, that I'll be making two brief mentions of suicide and suicidal ideation in this talk, around 22 minutes and 27 minutes through. Right. This is a photo of a plant that's in my backyard. It's an heirloom mum from my grandmother. I'm also wearing it on my lapel tonight. The mum was split from a plant in my grandma's garden and taken by my Aunt Jennifer sometime in the late 2000s. And a few years ago, after my grandmother had passed away, it was split again from Jennifer's plant and given to my mother. My mother then split it from me in 2021 after I'd become a gardener myself. And I'm going to confess here in front of you all tonight that I've become something of a native plants snob since I got into gardening. So it's unusual for me to have this cultivar, native in a sense to nowhere among the others in my yard. There's a sense of solidarity with the landscape that comes from using native plants, which I quite like, as though through tending them, I'm becoming prepared to recognize their kin out in the meadows and forests of our area. And of course, the local pollinators like them, and they're fit to the rhythms of rainfall and all the rest in our New England climate. So I'm embarrassed to admit that even though it came from my grandmother, it was uncomfortable for me to include this non-native mum in my garden, and I struggled to find a place for it. But I'm so happy that I did, and in this talk today, I want to get to the root of this mum, to understand where it comes from, and how it's possible I could have it in my garden at all, to excavate its histories and its meanings, because it turns out that it has a lot to say about some far-flung topics like kinship, patriarchy, difference, inheritance, and interspecies love. And what I've learned in thinking carefully about it, and what I want to show in my remarks tonight, is that mums are more than a gardening hobby or a showpiece. They are alive, and their lives and our lives have become entangled. And therefore, learning about mum history is like a lesson in our own. Mums have been subject to very intensive horticulture for centuries. So the mums that are on display at the Lyman Conservatory tonight look pretty different from their naturally occurring relatives. There are a few dozen species in the genus Chrysanthemum, but what we call chrysanthemums are actually complex hybrids of several different species. So in Latin nomenclature, they're typically referred to as a horticultural variety, Chrysanthemum hortorum. And that name's typically followed by a cultivar name like Cosmo Bordeaux or Lynn Johnson or Macho Time. And there are thousands of different cultivars, but they broadly fall into one of a dozen or so types according to their flower shape. These include incurve, reflex, anemone, quill, and so on, all selected by horticulturists over time to make these elaborate forms. And mine is different from the show plants on display at Lyman because it's an outdoor hardy mum that's fit to withstand our New England winters. And most common, actually, are the potted mums that are sold in late summer New England, which you can find blooming on people's doorsteps all over Northampton right now. The mum in my lapel might be a family plant, but of course, plants have their own families. And the mum's family is called the Asteraceae. And just like human families, plant families come in all sorts of different forms. You all know the Asteraceae, actually, which is sometimes called the daisy or sunflower family. They're all around us. Not only daisies, but dandelions are members, as are zinnias and other garden plants like marigolds and blazing stars. And the family is monophyletic, meaning that plant taxonomists are really certain about its delimitation or circumscription as a family. For some plant families, things aren't so clear, and in those cases, there's usually debate about which species go in which family and which genetic or morphological evidence supports that decision. But not the Asteraceae. Nobody doubts its boundaries as a family on morphological or genetic grounds, because its break was sharp enough to distinguish it from its closest relative, its sister family, the Calyceraceae. That split took place about 70 or 80 million years ago in South America. But while the Calyceraceae were not all that successful, and today that family comprises just 60 species and 4 genera, most of which occur in these high-altitude grasslands in South America, the Asteraceae are completely different. They went on to colonize the entire globe, and in the process, they radiated or diversified into one of, if not the most diverse families on the planet, with somewhere between 25 and 35,000 species. Today, that family occupies just about every continent and just about every kind of habitat. And the human species has something of a kinship with this family in the sense that many asters thrive in heavily disturbed areas or ones with lots of drought and difficulty. So again, think dandelions or fleabane or chicory or knapweed. As we fell more forests and mow more lawns, we welcome these asters into our world. But in addition to disturbance and drought tolerance, one of the keys to its success has been its flower morphology. So its flower is actually a pseudanthium, or a pseudo-flower, and what looks like a single flower is actually multiple, sometimes dozens of different small florets. Inside each one of these yellow petals on the outside is not actually a petal, but rather the corolla of an entire flower, so meaning all of the petals. So if you were to look carefully, you'd see that the lobes of the corolla have been fused together in this outer ray floret, and at the base are reproductive parts, pistils and stamens, just like you'd find inside each of these inner disc florets. Having all of these florets packed together like this is really useful because when a pollinator comes for some nectar, they can actually end up pollinating not one flower, but a bunch of flowers, and therefore fertilizing a bunch of ovules, which can turn into a bunch of seeds. And the changes that occurred over evolutionary time for these separate florets to aggregate together like this in such a way that they look like one flower with the outer florets elongated to attract pollinators, it's not unlike actually what we do with mum horticulture, elaborating the corollas into showy forms that might attract a visitor, such as yourself. It's interesting that the original locale of the genus Chrysanthemum, so where it radiated, distinct from other lineages, and where the plants today occur naturally, is in Asia. And that's interesting because mum horticulture originated there too. And our own mum show is like an echo of a mum tradition that began in China and Japan several thousand years ago and continues today. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with colonialism and the horticultural fashions that it brought about, which gave us the botanic gardens that we know today, mum horticulture became huge in Europe and the United States, so much so that the Smith College Botanic Garden felt compelled to teach students mum horticulture and even to organize an entire mum show beginning in 1901, for which it allocates serious resources in terms of planning, in cost, in horticultural expertise, and in terms of space within the Lyman Plant House. Mums draw a big crowd. And since the earliest days of the Mum Show, as part of the garden's educational mission, students were asked to partake in the horticultural work of hybridizing these plants, literally rubbing the anthers and pistils of two plants together to devise new forms and colors that might showcase what mums can do and be. Each year, visitors vote on the best mum hybrid, and the student is immortalized as the year's Mum Show winner, like these ones. Now, my grandmother would have been very happy to know that I was talking about mums, and her mums in particular, at the Smith College Botanic Garden Mum Show lecture. And not just because she liked mums, but because she, in fact, was a Smithy, class of 1943, and Smith was among the most important places in the world to her. And I have zero doubt that she attended the Mum Show when she was here, perhaps including 1942 when Annette Hervey won the Best Mum Award for her yellow quill mum. Maybe she even cast a vote for Annette's mum. Her name was Barbara Jessup Brewster, and she didn't graduate from Smith, but she attended for 3 years between 1939 and 1942 when she left to go work as a Rosie the Riveter in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And her departure also aligned with her marriage to my grandfather, who didn't go fight in the war because he worked at Remington Arms in Bridgeport. They ended up buying a house in nearby Milford, Connecticut, where they would raise 7 children. Now, I have 2 children of my own, and it's very difficult for me to imagine what it would be like to have 7 of them, particularly as a mother in 1950s USA, and particularly after having been empowered by a college education at Smith and having lots of varied ambitions as she did. She was like so many women at that time, emboldened by a vision of themselves as Rosie the Riveter with the biceps and everything, a figure that was emblazoned across the cultural landscape, but then after the war, thrust into the home and told it was their only and highest calling. I really struggle to imagine what that's like from where I stand now, and since taking this job at Smith in 2017 and thinking about her walking through these same hallways and sidewalks, a few years ago I picked up Sylvia Plath's work because Plath was such an incisive critic of that time. She also happens to remind me a lot of my grandmother. As you may already know, Plath is one of Smith's most famous alums. She was a poet and a novelist, and she arrived just a decade after my grandmother, and they had a similar kind of seriousness and ambition and indomitability and sense of purpose. I've met a lot of Smithies like this, actually, and they, flushed with these characteristics, they oftentimes find themselves bumping up against limits that are put upon them, limits that exist for reasons that aren't always clear. This is Barbara Brewster for sure. She read seriously, she played a dozen instruments, she led a bell choir at her church, played tennis into her 80s. She even vacationed with purpose, so going to the beach meant grabbing a field guide to identify mollusk shells. She came to Smith to study music, and in her 50s, after finishing her degree as a remote student at Goddard College, and after her children were mostly out of the house, she set upon a PhD in musicology at NYU, where she researched keyboard ornamentation in 17th century Iberian organ music, which entailed archival and field research in Spain. She submitted the dissertation a few months after her 60th birthday in 1980, which is the year I was born. Around that time, she got into woodworking, making early music instruments like the mandora and the cittern out of old bits of wood. Then, also in her 60s, she became intensely interested in geology, and she took my grandfather on really far-flung collecting trips that produced plastic bags and boxes full of rock specimens. With them, she set up what I can only call a permanent exhibit in her home, where they were interpreted and displayed as in a natural history museum, alongside geologic maps to show where they were from and why they were found there. In fact, she was the kind of person who could make you feel inadequate if you didn't take things as seriously as you should or could. She had an ambition that came out of a blast furnace of Protestant work ethics, the Depression, misogyny, and who really knows what else. These are the histories that we inherit, which we sometimes call intergenerational trauma. And it seems to me like we spend our lives trying to figure out what exactly we've been given. Who knows what was passed along to her, but she infected me with a respect for seriousness, for taking things seriously, but also a real insecurity about whether I'm serious enough, whether my focus is squarely on things that are meaningful enough. And I can still feel her eyes on me, actually, and I'll confess, I'm not sure that I'm making her proud. So you won't be surprised to learn that my grandmother took gardening quite seriously. She lived in Keene, New Hampshire during my grandparents' retirement years, and her garden was a regular stop on the town's annual garden tour. Whenever we'd visit from Michigan, she'd walk my mother through the garden to explain what she had growing and where. And as a child, I remember walking through the garden with them, struggling to understand what exactly we're looking at and why. A peony over here, a hosta over there. This one has trouble growing in that spot. This one has red flowers as opposed to the usual pink. Why all this gardening? Why all these garden tours and plant conservatories? Why do people like my grandma and my mom love plants so much? I think it's a question worth answering because here we are at a mum show, after all, and the answer's not at all that straightforward. And if we all reflected on it, I'd guess we each have a somewhat different story to tell. There are lots of reasons that people love plants, of course, and lots of ways to love them too. And I've often asked myself, how did I get into plants so hard? And for me, I think it has to do with a desire to understand place, to know where I'm at. I started gardening and botanizing, especially after arriving in Northampton. And that's in large part because Northampton was the first place that I'd lived for more than a few years, really since high school. Having come to Smith, Northampton became my actual long-term home, and I felt compelled to know this place. I began learning to identify the local plants around me, which kicked into higher gear when I started gardening at my home. And I even began contemplating teaching a course that might draw upon Smith's Botanic Garden. And the director, Tim Johnson, told me I should meet with Jimmy Grogan, the new conservatory curator at Lyman. Jimmy and I went on a walk, and I'll confess that I felt really embarrassed about how little I knew about plants in spite of my sincere and deep interest. But Jimmy was very obliging, and he told me all sorts of amazing things. And as we bumped into each other at Lyman, I became more interested in the Lyman collection, especially because I could see all these plant families that were not represented on the local landscape, like Isoaceae or Pedaliaceae. Now that I knew something more about the local plants that I was identifying, I found that the ones in Lyman looked even more extraordinary than I'd ever noticed, and vice versa. Knowing plants that come from far away helped me to see the plants in my own location, to see what was distinctive about them. I could see them better. Now, I love bumping into Jimmy at Lyman because Jimmy is one of the most interesting people I've ever met. And he helps me to see what's happening behind the scenes of the conservatory, this temple of plant love. For example, you might have wondered, like me, given that there are thousands of different plants growing at Lyman from all different parts of the world, each and create conditions that mimic the home environments of plants there. But with so many different species represented, the house is really a pretty blunt instrument. So a single house needs to contain a number of different environments. Some plants might be placed in an especially sunny spot within the house. Some might be given a potting medium or soil that drains especially quickly. Some will be moved to a cool spot to allow for the plant to go dormant during the winter. In short, where the building itself can't accommodate an individual plant's needs, informed care steps in. And Jimmy and the two other horticulturists, Lily Caron and Dan Babineau, provide this care regime, while also thinking about display and curation. So it's not simply about how to keep a plant alive or how to get a plant to flower even, but how to prune a plant in such a way that visitors can see it correctly, to see how it might look growing in the wild, for example, or to see what's especially distinctive about its stem or some other aspect of its form. One key skill they have, in fact, is that they've visited so many of the places where these plants are found. So it's a kind of worldliness or cosmopolitanism that enables their work. For example, Jimmy understands what a seasonally dry tropical forest looks and feels like. He understands how the air moves through such a system or how a plant there might be positioned in an understory. Jimmy actually has a PhD from the forestry program at Yale, and for his dissertation, he conducted a 5-year-long natural history study in a remote part of the northern Amazon. And that work was focused on mahogany trees, but it was really a project about a forest and all the species that live there, about the world in which mahogany trees find themselves living. So when he works here at the conservatory, the reason that Lyman looks so amazing with so much in flower at any given time and with so many things flowering that are difficult to get to flower in this artificial environment, it's not just because he understands plants, but because he understands place. He's been doing a 5-year-long natural history study of this place, too, of Lyman Conservatory, about what can grow where and why, what the sunlight's like here, or the airflow over there, how things change from summer to fall. So Lyman is actually like 1,000 different places rolled into one. It's almost like a teleportation device. As you move through the different houses, you move between entirely different geographic zones, each with their own distinct flora, their own distinct atmospheres, the temperature, the light, the humidity, the sound. It's filled with plants that come from all over the world and which you will probably never get to see in the wild. The collection is in constant motion, too, just like in nature, with some things blooming now, others later. And the plants remain in sync with their ancestral home. So when you see a plant in flower at Lyman, it's in flower in Spain or Madagascar or Brazil or Thailand or Morocco. At a plant conservatory, you get a sense for just how big our world is. And you realize that you walked in there maybe thinking that you lived at the center of that world, when in fact you live at the end of it, at the very outermost edges of it. So as you can tell, I think plant conservatories, and Lyman in particular, are amazing. And in fact, after my conversations with Jimmy, I got so interested that I started nerding out on old archival materials to learn more about Lyman's history. And I came across a brochure from 1914 from the Bausch & Lomb Optical Company that had been scanned and posted on the Botanic Garden website. Bausch & Lomb, it turned out, had entered into a collaboration with the first director of our garden and our botany department, a man named William F. Ganong. Ganong was a plant physiologist, meaning that he was interested in how plants survive. For example, how they photosynthesize or take up water and nutrients from the soil. And at Ganong's time, botanists knew relatively little about this suite of questions. And one of the things that they lacked were measuring tools to see and describe plant physiology. Ganong was a big deal, and he recently raised funds to build a new set of plant physiology laboratory buildings at Lyman, which are now the reception and the two houses where the Mum Show is held, actually, Physiology House and Cold Storage. So he developed this collaboration with Bausch and Lomb to create these physiology tools, which were state-of-the-art at the time and which were sold across the country. And Smith became an important site in the history of plant physiology, actually. Now, one of the devices in this Bausch and Lomb catalog was called a bell jar support. And because I'd been reading Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar at the time, I did a double take. There was a bell jar inside of which sat a plant. So I became really interested in bell jars and in the possibility that Plath got her metaphor from one. In case it's been a minute since you read it, the bell jar, which is initially published under a pseudonym, describes how its main character, a very promising college student named Esther Greenwood, struggles against living in a world that's not built for women, one full of sexism and with limited opportunities for employment and fulfillment, even for women privileged by whiteness, as was Esther. Esther spirals into depression after an internship at a women's magazine in New York City and attempts to take her own life. And this is a very similar path taken by Plath, actually, and the novel recapitulates some of Plath's college years, but in fictional form. So the bell jar metaphor captures the stifling conditions under which women live and which can lead to the kind of despair experienced by Esther. But as I reread the novel with botanical bell jars in mind, I saw that Plath isn't really explicit about where this unusual but captivating metaphor comes from. And there's a mountain of literary criticism on Plath's work, and when I researched it, I found that there was very little discussion about what a bell jar actually is. I saw suggestions that Plath was drawing on bell jars as a display case for pastries, so like a domestic kitchen object. Another pointed to the fact that bell jars can be used in beekeeping, and Plath's father was a bee zoologist. But these were scattered mentions, and nothing seemed very conclusive. However, in the novel, we do find Esther discussing at some length how she took a botany course that she quite liked. She says, "At college, I had to take a required course in physics and chemistry. I'd already taken a course in botany and done very well. I never answered one test question wrong the whole year, and for a while I toyed with the idea of being a botanist and studying the wild grasses in Africa or the South American rainforests, because you can win big grants to study offbeat things like that in queer areas much more easily than winning grants to study art in Italy or English in England. There's not so much competition." Botany was fine because I loved cutting up leaves and putting them under the microscope and drawing diagrams of bread mold and the odd heart-shaped leaf in the sex cycle of the fern. It seemed so real to me. So I wondered if Plath might have taken a botany course in college, like Esther, and sure enough, she did. It was in her first year, a year-long botany course called General Botany, Botany 1-1. Plath was entering college to study literature, and she graduated as an English major, but students were required to take a general distribution requirement for science at that time, and Plath chose botany. Incidentally, my grandmother chose geology, Geology 1-1. I also found a schedule of lab exercises from that course, which showed that in the first few weeks of class, she used bell jars in a lab exercise on photosynthesis. Plants were placed under bell jars and subject to different treatments, manipulating the atmosphere, attempting to make visible to the naked eye what was happening inside these leaves. Plath and her fellow students were even asked to draw bell jars that they were using, as well as the bread mold and the fern prothallus, as she described in the passage that I just read. Plath was very talented at drawing, and she would have taken this activity very seriously, noting the specific shape and character of her subjects. She was concurrently enrolled in a studio art class, actually. So I went into Lyman to ask Jimmy about bell jars, and he said, "Oh yeah, we have bell jars here. Dan uses them all the time." And he took me into the back, into the student greenhouse at Lyman, and sure enough, there was a bell jar with a few small plants underneath it. "We don't buy new bell jars either," he said, "so these are almost certainly the same ones that Plath would have used in her lab exercises." He showed me where they store them all. The more I searched, the more bell jars I found. We have archival photographs at special collections from the turn of the century onward, showing students and faculty conducting research with bell jars or being used in the classroom. It turns out that they're no longer used in plant physiology because the measurements that you get from devices like Ganongs are not super precise. However, they are still used in horticulture. Dan, for example, is in charge of the high humidity houses like Palm House, and some of the plants there would really like the atmospheric humidity to be quite a bit higher than it actually is. And for this reason, Dan sometimes uses bell jars to grow out cuttings of such plants like aroids or begonias. When you put a plant underneath a bell jar, it starts to create a high humidity environment because for plants to photosynthesize, they open up pores in their leaves called stomata that can let in atmospheric CO2, but in the process let out water vapor. And as I read more about bell jars, I learned that they were, in essence, a kind of prototype for larger greenhouses like Lyman Conservatory. So in the 16th century in Italy, horticulturists began using glass bells to grow out plants that came from areas with higher atmospheric humidity. Eventually, glass technology and architectural engineering both became sophisticated enough to build entire houses of iron and glass that made it possible to grow tropical plants in more northern latitudes, especially citrus plants, which were desired. Greenhouses work on the same principle as a bell jar, just at a much larger scale, creating the atmospheric conditions of faraway places. So I returned again to the novel, and first I looked at Plath's mentions of the bell jar metaphor. And the first mention comes when Esther has recently attempted suicide by overdosing on sleeping pills. And she's being driven from the medical hospital where she was convalescing to a mental institution. The driver is Philomena Guinea, who's a wealthy woman who helped to fund Esther's scholarship at college. And Guinea will also help to pay for these various medical costs, which are a strain on her mother. Esther understands that she should feel grateful to Mrs. Guinea, but she can't feel a thing. Even if Mrs. Guinea brought her a trip around the world, she narrates, it wouldn't matter. Wherever I sat, on the deck of a ship or at a street cafe in Paris or Bangkok, I'd be sitting under the same glass bell jar, stewing in my own sour air. But Plath describes the bell jar in less disparaging terms in her journals and letters. So for example, the first mention is in her journal entry from July 11th, 1952. So this is the summer after her second year at Smith, but prior to her magazine internship at New York City, which she would immortalize in her novel. In the journal entry, she used bell jars as a way to describe her intensely productive life at Smith, contrasted with the relaxing but empty condition of living outside the routines of school and work. And this was important, so I'm going to read at some length. Here's the transcribed text. Life was not to be sitting in hot, amorphic leisure in my backyard, idly writing or not writing as the spirit moved me. It was instead running madly in a crowded schedule, in a squirrel cage of busy people, working, living, dancing, dreaming, talking, kissing, singing, laughing, learning. The responsibility, the awful responsibility of managing profitably 12 hours a day for 10 weeks is rather overwhelming when there's nothing, no one to insert an exact routine into the large, unfenced acres of time, which is so easy to let drift by in soporific idling and luxurious relaxing. It's like lifting a bell jar off a securely clockwork-like functioning community and seeing all the little busy people stop, gasp, blow up, and float in the inrush, or rather outrush, of the rarefied, scheduled atmosphere. Poor little frightened people, flailing impotent arms in the aimless air. That's what it feels like, getting shed of a routine. Even though one has rebelled terribly against it, even then, one feels uncomfortable when jounced out of the repetitive rut. And so with me. What to do, where to turn, what ties, what roots, as I hang suspended in the strange thin air of back home. So in this image, the bell jar hangs over productive, sometimes routinized activity, not simply work and school, but also dancing, dreaming, talking, kissing, and so on. Life outside the bell jar is free from that atmosphere, but also removed from the thrill of life. Plath's ambivalent. She's clearly critical of the demanding lifestyle, but she derives pleasure and satisfaction from it too, and has a distaste for amorphic leisure and the thin air back home. Life was not to be amorphic, she says. So it's not that life under the bell jar is good, of course. It's complicated. It may be oppressive with pressures and routines, but it can also be gay and drunken with growth and life and joy. So it's a space of contingent productivity. I'll return to this shift in the bell jar metaphor from this journal entry to the novel in a moment. But what's interesting here is that this insight in the bell jar novel about the human condition, specifically the condition of women, stemmed from an intimate interspecies encounter with a plant, where she learned how the plant produced food and interacted with its atmosphere. This was a transformative moment of recognition in which the plant became materially real and alive, and also a figure for doing interpretive work. So the plant itself matters to this story. So before turning back to my grandmother's mum, who was this plant? The plant used in the experiment with the bell jar was the silverleaf geranium, Pelargonium pseudoides. Pelargonium is the second largest genus in the geranium family, Geraniaceae, and like most pelargoniums, pseudoides is native to southern Africa. And it's a very adaptable plant. You can find at sea level and in the mountains. It likes arid conditions, but it can also handle a good deal of rain if it's in well-drained soil. It can survive fire and even an occasional frost. So it's got a wide distribution across South Africa and Lesotho. The plant is actually widely known in horticulture too, and we have one at Lyman, pictured above. Now, I know what I know about pelargoniums from Lily Caron, the lead horticulturist for Lyman's show house, where pelargoniums are kept alongside other fragrant plants and succulents, many of which also come from southern Africa. Lily explained to me that Pelargonium pseudoides is a good conservatory plant in the sense that it has attractive and aromatic leaves, an interesting stem form, and abundant flowers. The leaves are heart-shaped, gently wrinkled at the margins and pubescent. The flowers are borne in these terminal umbels, and they range in color from dark red to maroon to almost black in color. And again, it's adaptable, so it can handle life in a pot. One reason that Lily has been tasked with caring for the pelargoniums in show house, in fact, is that she spent a lot of time in South Africa, and she knows them from the natural landscape. She knows how they inhabit their own space, and when she pruned and repotted this one in 2021, she did so with an eye toward showcasing its natural habit with this sprawling, branching form. I think it's amazing. Like the mum, pelargoniums are long-standing ornamental houseplants, not just conservatory plants, and some of you in the audience actually might own one. The houseplant varieties look somewhat different, like these ones, with more robust and often variegated leaves. And at the time that Plath was a student in Botany 1-1, geranium cultivars were already quite popular, and some of that horticultural work actually happened at Smith. So one photo from 1911 shows Ganong alongside his students in the newly constructed physiology house. In front of them sits a brick and concrete island that stands today, upon which are dozens of pelargonium plants, perhaps hybrid cultivars that they were developing to train students for work in the horticultural trade. So it's not surprising that Plath used this plant in her lab exercises, given Lyman's history with them. And it's perhaps not surprising to hear about these botanical influences, given that her poetry and prose make numerous mentions of geraniums and lots of other plants and fungi, which she often turned to as a way of making sense of the human condition, to theorize what it means to be a human. Plath is often depicted as being obsessed with death and darkness, but I don't think that's her at all. In this encounter with Pelargonium pseudoides, we can see that her preoccupation was with life, more specifically the limitations imposed upon it. In this lab experiment at Lyman, she was taught to see how plants breathed and sustained themselves, to understand what atmosphere meant to them, and to comprehend the conditions for life of this radically other life form. In the bell jar, Esther describes being moved by the language of botany, the form of plants, and by their mechanism of transpiration. She's excited by, quote, leaf shapes and enlarged diagrams of the holes the leaves breathe through, and fascinating words like carotene and xanthophyll, end quote. This was an embodied cross-species connection that helped her to understand the human condition. They may have been foreign life forms and part of foreign academic terrain, but they were real and alive and present there in front of her. She would have watched the plant enclosed within the bell jar, fogging up the glass as the humidity rose. Following the lab instructions, she would have plucked its leaves to bathe them in alcohol and iodine as a way of understanding in intimate detail how exactly it lived in the world. Finally, she would have learned that this plant inhabits a world that's not its own, a South African plant thriving within the confines of a conservatory in New England through the care of Lyman horticulturists. This was an encounter across not only species difference then, but also geographic difference. In thinking through these botanical and horticultural contexts, I think we have a glimpse into what may have prompted this shift in her use of the bell jar metaphor. In her journal on summer vacation, she recounted life under the bell jar as rich and gay, even if routinized and intense. But by the following summer, after an internship at Mademoiselle magazine with her first taste of life outside the artificial environment that was Smith College, and by the time she wrote the novel about that experience 4 years later, the metaphor took on a darker tone. Like the plant conservatory, the bell jar is a technology for making dislocated life possible. The world that Plath and my grandmother moved through in the USA and the UK of the 1950s was not built for them. It wasn't fit to support them and to receive their extraordinary gifts. And it was only in spite of the constraints upon them that they achieved what they did. That Plath arrived at her trans-species insights at Smith College makes sense, given its long history with bell jars, including Ganong's development of apparatuses for making plant physiology measurements, and the horticultural tradition with both mums and pelargoniums. It also makes sense that these observations came from her time at Smith in another way. Historically, women's colleges have been their own kind of technology for helping people thrive in a world otherwise not built to support them and to receive their gifts. We can only guess at the precise reasons for this shift in her metaphor, but my sense is that she began to see in it not only an evocative image of a glass enclosure with its alienation, its sense of being observed, and its own peculiar atmosphere, but also an account of how one might find themselves living within a society and yet apart from it. Now, since becoming so interested in conservatories, I often get the question, aren't conservatories just like zoos for plants or pernicious relics of the colonial period where they got their start? I've come to feel very strongly that living in a time of mass extinction, as we are, in a time when people are largely uninformed about or uninterested in the plant world, that plant conservatories might be among the most important institutions we have. First, they're sites in which to revel in and contemplate the forms and textures and diversity of our world. Places for joy and love and community, curiosity and patience, all of which we desperately need. And also, as the decolonial social theorist La Paperson says, colonial institutions oftentimes feature space for what La Paperson calls decolonial riders, those who might commandeer resources and institutional power and ways of thinking to do decolonial work. Rather than seeing plant conservatories strictly as sites for recapitulating colonial ways of thinking, as some critics would have it, I see them as potentially well-resourced staging grounds for critiques of colonialism, of patriarchy, and of the conditions that make life possible for some and impossible for others. Now, this doesn't mean that plant love is uncomplicated. As the feminist theorist Donna Haraway explains, interspecies love is always non-innocent. So the relationships we have with our dogs, for example, which is her focus, these are relationships born of histories full of colonialism and white supremacy and human exceptionalism, histories full of pet food industries and puppy mills and more. This doesn't mean that we should stop loving our dogs, though. It means that we need to see clearly those relationships, their politics and their possibilities. We need to inherit the histories that come with them, as she says, so that we can do right by our dogs, so we can live well alongside them across species difference. Plath taught us to see the effects of patriarchy by taking plants seriously as subjects. Lyman made this encounter possible because of its long tradition of horticultural education and because of its horticultural expertise. And it was also because Plath encountered this plant that was at once exotic and domestic, a house plant that's from far away, strange but familiar. And here we see how insight into one's own world, one's place in that world, emerges through encounters with other places, other lives, and other worlds. Having lived with this mum that comes from Asia by way of my grandmother, I've come to feel that there's some dangerous risks associated with the rush to native plants. Now, we can and should still be for native plants, but we need to keep these risks in mind. And they include an amplification of suspicion regarding foreign things, and a fetishization of origins, an essentializing of one's relationship to place that understands identity as preordained rather than formed in relationships with others across difference. Essentialized identity can feel like a just politics in the way that it assigns rights and belonging and community, but it's an uncurious kind of politics, and one that risks ignoring the histories that make us and which make our world. You might have kin you never knew you had. In a way, then, plants tell you who you are and where you are, even when they come from far away. Our bum show is like a machine for making place, for tracing histories and geographies. Lyman's not just a tool, then, for growing plants, but for growing places. Rather than see conservatories and mum shows and non-native plants as out of place, artificial, or inauthentic, I think they should be seen as authentic opportunities to learn where on earth you happen to be. A common refrain about Plath's work has been to deride it as mere autobiography. That is, as Seamus Heaney put it, a poet I love and who otherwise thought very highly of Plath, the limit on her poetry is its, quote, dominant theme of self-discovery and self-definition, end quote. There's one reason I think that the term confessional has been assigned to her work, as though her work represents merely an impulse to talk about oneself out of shame or fear. Given that the bell jar so closely tracks with Plath's own life experience, some have accused it of being less than fiction, as though it's a cheap usage of fact, plied by someone without the skill of composing fictive stories. As though nonfiction stories don't require the skill of composition, and as though seeing the architecture of an entire society in the events of one's life is unremarkable. Plath had the extraordinary ability to see how her own life and experience was iconic of broader movements in the world. Rather than mere autobiography, Plath had the vision to see how the world she bumped up against expressed something shared by a broader humanity. She had the vision to see it, but also the courage to speak it, because let's face it, many of the limits on our lives are, if not invisible, then unsayable. It takes courage to speak them out loud. And not only did she have the vision and the courage, but also the craft to deliver that point through literature to an audience, to us. She begs the question of all of us, what if all our lives were like this? What if all our lives pointed to the conditions of life on earth? If only we had the vision to see it, the courage to say it, and the craft to describe it well. In such a way, following Haraway, following Plath, we might just see that our everyday lives are charged with meaning. Inheriting a mum, say, what do I touch when I touch this mum? What have I received here, and how do I do right by this life that's now somehow part of mine? One way to think about the novel, The Bell Jar, is as an answer to the question that Plath posed in her journal. What to do, where to turn, what ties, what roots, as I hang suspended in the strange thin air back home. These ties, these roots, to seeing what's right in front of us, to this mum from my grandmother, from my mother, from my sons. Thank you.
That was fantastic. We have time for 2 or 3 questions, and if you'll give me a moment to get the mic to you so that our streaming viewers can hear your question.
Oh, I just wanted to invite the opportunity. Professor Hoag, do you want to talk about how Sylvia Plath wrote a press release for the Mum Show when she was at Smith?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And she was a press correspondent for the Hampshire Gazette, basically, on the press board during her time at Smith. And so we actually have copies of that document, which is really interesting.
Oh, thank you. That was very interesting. Luckily, it'll be on YouTube so I can listen to it again. Just a very simple question. What was the diagram on your main screen of the scale?
Oh, I'm not sure how to go.
It didn't look like a bell jar, but it was on that one. What is that?
This is another one of Ganong's plant physiology apparatuses. I think this one is called a transpirograph, and I forget its exact function, but I believe that as the plant transpired, it would trace a line on a sheet of paper to show how some plants transpire at different rates than others, if I remember correctly.
Colin, one of the questions from our streaming audience, can you speak to the potential opportunities you see for other social science or humanities faculty to connect with Lyman and the collections of the Botanic Gardens?
Oh my gosh, yeah. I can think of lots of them. One of the things that I think is really lovely about the site is that it opens up to so many different questions, but also that it feels like a respite from the classroom, actually. And there are lots of ways to connect. And I'm happy to talk with anybody about those kinds of connections, including with the Plath exhibit, by the way. I'm always happy to show people around or to give a lecture in your class. That's always welcome.
Hi. Not that there has to be an answer to this question, but why do you describe us as being at the end of the world instead of just on another part of it?
Yeah, thank you, Noosh. That was, I suppose, a way of decentering the human, which is, I think, a really important work. Strange as that sounds for somebody coming from an anthropology department, which has anthropos, humankind, kind of at the center of things. But that's been an important conversation in our discipline, actually, that for a long time, scholars, and I would argue the general public, has found a way of imagining that the human condition is not a multi-species one. And so there are lots of problems with that. And I think one of the first steps is to kind of admit that we have a problem, I guess.
I think we have time for one more question, and then Colin will actually be coming back to Lyman, and so you might have a chance to ask him questions there as well.
I just wanted to add, so I was in Professor Hoag's class and I did research on chrysanthemums, and just to give you all like an idea of how ancient they are, I think they were cultivated in China as back as like over 1000 BC, and they were brought to Japan by Buddhist monks in 400 AD, and they have a chrysanthemum festival in Japan every year. So I just wanted to give context to like how ancient and old and how far back these plants go.
Thank you.
Let's give Colin one more round of applause, please.
That's it. Thank you.
And then we will welcome you back to Lyman to see the bell jars and a preview of the Mum Show. Thank you all.